Hello and welcome to Pocket Size Apologetics. I am your host, Ken Coughlin. Thank you very much for joining us here for another week where we're going to put our thinking caps on for a little while. For those who don't know, the purpose of the show or the way the show works is each week we talk about one little snippet of information. We don't want to dive too deep into too much, try to cover too much territory all at once. But we do want to dive pretty deeply into that one particular thing. So whatever it may be, whatever the subject of the day may be, we're going to keep it limited and keep it very focused, but we're going to go into detail about it so that you get a deeper understanding about the defense of the Christian faith. Now, as far as where we're at and where we've been at here, just so you know, we've been walking through for the past year or so, we've been walking through various different arguments for the existence of God. In other words, affirmative arguments that tend to claim to show that God exists. And what we've done recently is this week and last week, we've kind of shifted our focus. So now we're looking at arguments that are allegedly in favor of atheism. In other words, most of the time you look at atheistic arguments, really all they are is their responses to those arguments for God's existence. They're trying to tear those down. But there are a few that get put out there that are claimed to be affirmative arguments for atheism, to prove that atheism is true, that God does not exist. And so that's kind of what we're looking at right now. And today we're starting out or last week actually we started out by looking at the problem of evil. All right. In other words, specifically we've been talking about the evidential problem of evil. We talked about the logical problem and dismissed that last week, but we're talking about the evidential problem of evil. And the evidential problem of evil basically says that given that evil exists, which we can't deny, they believe it is unlikely that an omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent being exists, which of course is how Christianity defines God. So in this case, it's not saying there's any logical contradiction per se between the existence of a loving God and the existence of evil in the world. It's just saying that given the amount of evil we see out there, we just don't think it's very likely to believe that that is true. There's just too much evil, in other words. Now, as I mentioned last week, in order to respond to this brand of the problem of evil, the evidential problem of evil, we need to formulate what's called a theodicy. That term theodicy, we said, comes from two Greek terms, which mean literally the justification of God. In other words, we need to offer up some plausible reason why God might allow evil. If the whole source of the objection is, I just don't think it's likely to believe that God, if he exists, would allow this much evil in the world, we've got to show why, yeah, it kind of is. All right, and that's what a theodicy does. All right, now, when we're doing that, again, this is a real quick crash course on the highlight points from last week. When we're doing that, we need to bear in mind two different types of evil. One is called natural evil, which is the evil that results from natural causes like starvation, disease, physical deformity, and natural disasters. And the other is called moral evil, evil that results from personal action, personal depravity, torture, murder, war, cheating, things like that. I did mention briefly last week that I'm not a big fan of referring to those things that result from natural causes as evil. I think that kind of confuses the issue a little bit because evil is a moral term. It implies that there was a moral agent, someone who could bear moral responsibility for doing either right or wrong, or for choosing to do either right or wrong. And a tornado doesn't choose which way to go, okay? And so I said I don't really like using the word evil to describe those, although it is pretty common in the philosophical circles. And so, I mean, for purposes of today and next week, you might hear me using the term evil for both, just because that's what's normally done, but I've already voiced my objections to it. So what we're going to do today I'm going to be offering up one theodicy, one explanation that I claim is a plausible explanation for why God may allow evil. And this week we're going to be talking about what's called the Freewill Theodicy. And then next week, we're going to cover another one. It's going to be called the soul-making theodicy. All right. But first, what I want you to understand about the Freewill Theodicy that we're going to be talking about today is that the way a Christian thinks about this theodicy, or whether you accept it at all, frankly, may be influenced by the denomination you belong to. All right. Typically, most scholars will say that the free will theodicy only applies to brands of Christianity that embrace what is called libertarian free will. All right. Libertarian free will is what says we have the power to freely choose everything, including whether or not to accept Christ's sacrifice. All right. Now, other brands of Christianity, however, such as Calvinists, who have a very strong sense of God's sovereignty, will say that we are too fallen. Our will is too fallen to freely choose God, and that faith itself is God's free gift to us. And so under those denominational views, we only come to Christ because God gave us faith. And in all candor, that's my personal view. All right. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, wait a minute, Ken, you just said that's your personal view. Then why are you teaching a class here on the Freewill Theodicy? Shouldn't you not accept it? Well, my personal view is that I don't agree with those who say that you have to accept complete and total libertarian free will in all decisions in order to accept the Freewill Theodicy. And I'll get to why a little bit later here. But first what we need to do is we need to explain what the Freewill Theodicy is. All right? Now, some people will tell you that it's been long regarded as kind of the most popular or the most compelling of all the theodicies, all the explanations of why God may allow evil. What you've got on the screen right there is a quote from Alvin Plantinga in his book, God, Freedom, and Evil, and he says this. He says, "A world containing creatures who are significantly free and freely perform more good than evil actions is more valuable, all else being equal, than a world containing no free creatures at all." And I do like, and this will kind of give you a hint by why I think that even those who don't believe we can freely accept God or freely accept Christ and have to be given that by God, I think the Freewill Theodicy can still work in those systems, and it hinges on Alvin Plantinga's word here significantly. World whose creatures are significantly free. All right, so what does that mean? All right, if you think about it, what causes moral evil? I'm talking about moral evil here, all right? Those evil acts that are carried out by people, by moral agents, all right? What causes them is the decisions that people make, right? Individual people arrive at particular decisions, and they choose to do the wrong thing, essentially. Well, what that means then is that God can't intervene in human history to prevent moral evil without interfering with another thing that is very good, and that thing is free will, the ability to make our free choices. Now, why do we say that free will is a good thing? Well, think about it for a second. What would a world look like if nobody had the ability to freely choose their actions? Whenever somebody started choosing an action that God didn't want them to do, he stepped in and he prevented them from making that choice. Well, if in that situation, their freedom would be an illusion, wouldn't it? We'd all be a bunch of robots, a bunch of pre-programmed automatons that are just going to carry out whatever God wants us to do. We're little wind-up toys that, God set down on earth and lets them go in their predetermined way, all right? Does anybody want that? Is there anybody out there watching right now that can say, yes, absolutely, I would love to be an automaton and have no choice whatsoever in anything that I do, anything that I think, anything that I believe? I just want, I want to be a robot. I aspire to be a robot. Well, if somebody actually does genuinely believe that, I think that most of us would reasonably say that there's something wrong there, and they need some help, because we do value freedom. So there is an inherent good in freedom. And the problem with the problem of evil is that in order to stop these people's free choices, you're going to have to interfere with freedom. But sometimes if you give people free choices, what are they going to choose? They're not always going to choose the right thing. They're going to choose evil sometimes. So you can't have one without the other. In other words, you can't have free will without also allowing for the possibility of evil. All right? So the other point I want to make about this, well, there's a lot of points I want to make, but the next point I should say that I want to make about this is I want people to reflect on trying to truly appreciate what you're asking for. If you were to ask God to eliminate all evil, so nobody can ever make an evil choice in this world, do you really understand what you're asking him to do? Because most of us, when we are judging what's good and what's evil, and we're making that evaluation in our minds, we're evaluating that based upon a human standard, all right? Or lots of times our own personal standard. When we define what is good and what is evil, it's based on what we personally think is good and what we personally think is evil, all right? I got news for you. That's not how God judges, because God ain't you. God ain't human. Humans aren't perfect. God is. And so the standard that God is judging by to separate what's good from what evil is a perfect standard. And so lots of times when we say that when we focus on the problem of evil, we're outward focused. We want to say we want God to stop all the evil we see out there. But we're completely ignoring that by asking him to stop all evil, we're also asking him to stop all the evil that's in here. All right? How many of your choices that you make on a day-to-day basis would really be impacted if God really did that? And I think we vastly underestimate the impact that would have because we're all sinners. All right. And so things that we think are, well, maybe that's not as bad. Maybe I did this, that. But, no, you understand that if you're asking God to eliminate all evil, that means he's interfering with you. And he's probably going to be interfering with a lot of your choices that you don't want him to interfere with. All right. That's because we're in rebellion against God. So another point I want to make here, and this one actually came up right before I went on the air. I hadn't originally included in my notes, and I'm ashamed to say I hadn't. But some people try to deny that free will exists altogether. I actually just had a conversation when I post links to this show in various different Christian groups so people can come on and hopefully participate. And one particular gentleman commented something to the effect of that free will doesn't exist. Free will is an illusion. And he went on to say, therefore, it doesn't defeat the theodicy. He was confusing what the term theodicy means. The free will problem, as we explained before, the free will objection is not a theodicy. A theodicy is how we respond to the free will problem, but whatever. So he had said that, that he did not think that the free will existed at all. And I just responded to him with a question. Did you freely arrive at that conclusion? And the issue you see here is that you can't deny free will without implicitly affirming free will. Because you assume, when you say, I don't believe in free will, you're assuming that that is your freely arrived at conclusion. Because what's the alternative? If you were a robot that was programmed to arrive at that conclusion, then could you trust it? You'd have no idea if it's really true or not, because you were programmed to believe it, whether you would otherwise choose to or not, no matter what the evidence. We can get computers to say all sorts of junk. We can get them to say, the moon is made of blue cheese if we want to get a computer to say that, because we can program the computer to say that. But if that's how our knowledge works, if we're like computers that are just programmed to say what we say, are programmed to believe what we believe, then we would have no way of knowing if what we actually believe is true. And that's what's called determinism. All right. So that's the problem that this gentleman has. When he says, I don't believe free will exists at all, I ask him, well, is that your freely arrived at conclusion? Because if the answer is yes, he did freely arrive at that conclusion, then he's just contradicted his earlier statement. He does believe in free will. All right. If he says no, that he didn't freely arrive at that conclusion, that it was determined, then he also defeats his position because he shows he has no reason to trust it, to believe it's actually true. All right. Now, what this gentleman did actually do, so he went on to say that he believes that all knowledge is given to us by God. All knowledge, mind you. All knowledge is given to us by God. And, in a causal relationship, in a remote cause or ultimate cause, maybe that's the best way to put it, an ultimate cause kind of analysis, you could say that's true because God did create us, right? And he created us with a capacity to learn. But that's not what this gentleman was hinting at. What this gentleman was saying is that every single belief we have was given to us by God, which causes, I could have gone down so many paths with that one, because that means that if every belief is given to us by God, does that mean that even the beliefs, people that reject him, that belief was given to them by God? There's all sorts of issues with that belief, with that view, but I kind of tried to keep on the same track that I was on. I asked him for that. Really, did you freely arrive at that conclusion? So did you freely arrive at the conclusion that all knowledge is given to us by God? And he responded to me that he said, well, you may think you're being clever, but the answer to that question is the same as the answer to the first one. In other words, he believes that all knowledge is given to us by God because he believes that all knowledge is given to us by God. That's called circular reasoning, ladies and gentlemen. All right, it's a logical fallacy. He basically has no foundation for what he believes in that case. Pointed it out to him. I don't know if he's responded to that. I haven't had a chance. I had to go on the air, so I don't know if he responded after that. But that's the problem with denying free will exists altogether. You can't. You logically can't deny the existence of free will. You're always going to fall on circular reasoning or a contradiction, self-contradiction or something. In order to even utter the fact, the belief that free will doesn't exist, you're first assuming that free will exists. All right? And most philosophers will get that, but you do see it sometimes bandied about on the internet. All right, so here's the next question that people often raise to this one. If God is omnipotent, all right, he's all-powerful, all right, then why couldn't he create humans that always chose to do the right thing? In other words, if you think about it, there's no logical contradiction, there's no logical problem with saying that this particular human at this particular time for this particular choice made the right choice, all right? And so if it's possible for a human to freely choose the right thing in one instance, then isn't it logically possible for that human to freely choose the right thing in all instances? And then, if it's true, it's possible for one human to freely choose the right thing in all instances, isn't it logically possible for all humans to freely choose the right thing in all instances? All right? No. The answer to the question is no, if you think about it. Because what you've done is step by step, you've built your way up to determinism. All right? When you phrase the objection that way, essentially what you're saying is, why can't God create free creatures that will always choose one particular thing? All right, we'll always decide one particular way. It's a contradiction in terms to say that they will always choose one way freely. Those two terms are contradictions. It's kind of like this. People will always say, if God is omnipotent, he can do everything, right? Well, can he create a square circle? No, that's not what Christians mean by saying God is omnipotent, because those two are contradictory. We're not saying that God can do things that are logically contradictory. The other one that people like to say is, can God create a stone so heavy he can't lift it? These are word games. These are mind games. All right, they're just little semantic tricks that are played. And what they're doing is they're putting in two things that are logically contradictory and saying, well, why can't God do that? Because nobody's saying God can do things that are logically contradictory. All right, the same thing is true here. To say that someone is free and yet they will always choose one way are contradictions. Those are logically contradictory things. So no, it's not possible for God, it's not logically possible for God to create a world that has both free creatures and have those creatures always choose one way. Those things don't mix. All right. Now, one point I want to make here before we go any further, and hopefully you can see that you've seen this so far, is that some theodicies, some responses we give to the problem of evil might only apply to one category or the other. All right. In this situation, the Freewill Theodicy, let's face it, it only applies to moral evil. All right. It has no application whatsoever to natural evils, to natural occurrences like tornadoes. Because again, we get back to a tornado does not have free will. Nobody disputes that. All right. So what that usually means is when we're responding to the problem of evil, what Christians need to do is take a cumulative case approach. All right. You're going to want to know multiple answers to this question and be able to throw them out. Because when you create the big picture, when you pile one theodicy on top of another, then eventually you get to the point where, yeah, we can give plausible reasons why God might allow all the evil things we see happening in the world today. But that also gets back to why I don't like referring to those natural occurrences as evil. Because if they were truly evil, then the Freewill Theodicy would apply to them, because the Freewill Theodicy assumes a moral agent. The term evil really assumes a moral agent. And so but that's why we need to take a different approach when we're talking about something as different as natural phenomenon. All right. Moving on here, and if anybody is tuning in live and wants to ask any questions, feel free, put them in the live chat. I got it going right here, and I'd be happy to try to answer them on the air for you. Now, so let's get back to what I said at the beginning, all right? Why do I believe that this Freewill Theodicy is still compatible, even with Christian views that do not accept full-fledged libertarian free will in every decision that we make? Christians who hold, like I do, that faith itself is a gift from God, all right, will say that humans do not freely choose God. Not only do not, but cannot freely choose God. God has to step in. All right, I agree with that. But that does not mean, I think this is the problem that this gentleman that I was interacting with online beforehand got into, that does not mean that humans have no freedom whatsoever. Saying that we are never going to freely choose this or make this particular choice, this particular decision, does not mean we're never going to make any free choices whatsoever. I mean, even the most evil person in the world can freely choose whether he's going to do evil deed 1 or evil deed 2, right? He still chooses between them. And so simply saying that we will never make this free choice, this particular free choice, we will never choose God, basically, because of our fallen nature, does not eliminate free will entirely. It does not mean that we don't have free will. All right, so, but this begs a question, doesn't it? Ken, are you saying that God intervenes in our free will in this one instance as far as the ability to choose him? Yeah, I am. All right, so why does God intervene in that one instance, all right, in order to get people to have faith in Christ, but not in others? All right. If he could interfere with our free will in that instance, why couldn't he morally interfere with our free will in other instances? Now, before I answer that, I want to address one other common objection that atheists often raise to the Freewill Theodicy, which, by the way, ties into my answer to that denominational question. All right, and the objection. Well, first of all, notice what I said at the very beginning of this video. I talked about that what a theodicy is and what I'm offering here is a possible reason why God may allow some amount of evil in the world. All right, for all we know, God very well may have stopped a lot of evil from happening. But because he stopped it, it didn't happen. So we didn't see it, and we would never know. But we have to admit, at the same time, to be fair, we have to admit that he clearly has allowed some evil to slip through, hasn't he? Even if he is stopping some evil deeds, some evil still happens. I've often had atheists ask me why God doesn't stop evil from happening. To which I respond, how do you know he hasn't? I mean, seriously, how do you know he hasn't? How do you know that if God had not intervened, that there wouldn't have been a whole lot more evil in the world than what we see today? I mean, you can't know that, can you, logically speaking? So it's illogical to say, why isn't God stopping evil? You can never know that. All right? What they're doing is they're setting up a burden of proof that's impossible to ever be met. All right? They're stacking the deck, in other words. They're essentially saying, I won't believe unless I can be convinced that God has intervened and stopped evil from happening. All right? But how could they ever know that? How could you ever meet that challenge that they're raising? The only way to ever know for sure that God has stopped all evil from happening is for him to know that God has stopped evil from happening, is for him to have stopped all evil from happening. Let me give you an example from what I mean. Let's say you look out in the world today and you see 100 evil actions. All right? And what does that mean? That could mean that that's all the evil anyone was going to attempt today, those 100 evil acts. But then again, maybe people actually attempted 500 acts of evil and God stopped 400 of them. Either way, the result's going to be the same, isn't it? We're still going to see the same thing, 100 evil actions. So we can't know for sure, just based on the evil we see in the world, whether God is stopping evil or whether he's not. And so when an atheist insists on disbelieving in God unless we show them definitive proof that God has intervened to stop evil, like I said before, they're stacking the deck. They might as well be saying, no matter what you say, I will never be convinced that God exists. All right? And that's just not rational. Because think about it. In order to meet their burden, like I said, God would have to stop all evil from happening. But if he stops all evil from happening, then he has to completely eliminate our free will. All right? That gets us right back to the free will issue again. So, which brings us all back to the question that I asked before. Why would God interfere with free will in matters of having faith in Christ, but not in other instances? The same question here could be asked, though, couldn't it? How do you know he hasn't interfered in other instances? Maybe he has, all right? But wait, you may ask. Doesn't that defeat the whole free will theodicy as a whole? I mean, because if it's okay for God to interfere in our free will in some cases, why is it not okay for him to interfere in our free will in all cases? Let me ask you this. It's an analogy I like to make. Do anybody out there watching have children? All right, I do. I've got one who's about to turn 18 and another that actually turns 13 1 week from today. As a parent, part of your job is to teach your kids how to function as adults, right? And that means as they get older, you're giving them a bit more room on the whole proverbial leash, right? You give them a bit more freedom to make their own choices. Now, you know that when you do this, that yes, sometimes they're going to get hurt, all right? They're going to make the wrong choice when you're giving them that freedom. But they're going to learn from that, won't they? And so you still allow them to do it. Now, there are other times when there are certain decisions that would harm them so much that you just ain't being a good parent if you give them that freedom, all right? And so you do have to step in and limit their freedom in some ways, all right? So sometimes we will interfere with their free choices, but other times we won't. Even on our limited human scale, we can see examples where we accept that it's sometimes okay to interfere with freedom, even though as a general rule, it's a good thing to let people make free choices, right? Now, you may ask, and a lot of people will when they hear that, then why didn't God step into any one particular case, all right, to one particular evil thing that maybe happened to us, maybe happened to a loved one? And to that, the answer I can give is, I don't know, all right? I can't know why God has chosen in specific instances. I can give you this broad overview of what the general framework may plausibly be, but I'm not going to be able to tell you in one specific instance why he allowed this to happen or that to happen. What I can say is this. He's given us enough to trust him. All right? That's what faith is all about. That's what Christian faith is all about. It's about trusting God. All right? He's given us enough to see that freedom is a good thing, that generally speaking, we wouldn't want that to be suppressed. He's given us enough to see instances where it would be morally justified to limit someone's freedom, even though in most instances we shouldn't. And he's given us enough to know that if he is infinite and we are finite, then he's going to have a better understanding of these issues and be far better at working them out than we are. So he's given us enough to trust him, all right? But he did more than that. According to Christianity, he also sent his only begotten Son, Jesus Christ, to earth to live as we live and to suffer more than we can imagine. So when things do happen in our lives and we do suffer, we know that we have a divine shoulder to cry on that knows exactly what we're feeling because he quite literally has been there. So that's my summary of the Freewill Theodicy. One reason God may plausibly allow some evil in the world is because of the value of free will. Because he values free will. Free will is a good thing that he wants us to have, but that inevitably means that sometimes we will freely choose the wrong thing. All right? And when we do that, evil will result. Moral evil will result. Now, next week, what we're going to do is we're going to build on this a bit, and we're going to talk about something called the soul-building theodicy or the soul-making theodicy. It's actually kind of related to what I was talking about here at the end with that parent and child analogy. Those of you that tune in this week and will also tune in next week, you'll probably see a connection there between the two. So that's it. If you do have any questions, shoot them in the comments section, and I will try to take a look at that between now and next week, and I can answer any questions you have on the air on next week's program. All right? Thank you all very much for joining us. See you next week. God bless.